Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Avantasia, titled Ghostlights. So when I talked about the mute gods a couple days ago, I brought up how supergroups tend to market themselves. These people are attached to something that you already know and that you already like, and now they're all working together, so you should buy that too. In truth, that's one of a few ways, the second being a lot more complicated and a lot more unlikely. One artist with a defining vision recruiting a whole team of established artists in order to realize that grand scheme and plan. Now, some of you will inevitably point towards hip-hop and say, well, duh, we get this all the time, but this falls into a slightly different category, because how often do all those guest verses really fit in with the story or concept, presuming there is a story or concept at all? When you narrow it down like that, the list gets a lot smaller, and also further divides into two categories, this time focusing on the man behind said project. Is that man a musical genius capable of sketching out a vast world where every unique singer plays a distinctive part, or is he simply an incredibly gifted networker who has some solid connections? In the former category, when you talk about metal, the name that immediately leaps to mind is Arjen Lucassen, founder of the incredible progressive metal Arion project. And on the flip side, in the latter category, I'd probably say you have Tobias Sammet, frontman of Edguy and leader of the symphonic power metal project Avantasia. Now, I've been getting asked about my opinions on Avantasia since I mentioned that I like symphonic metal, but prior to doing this review, I had never really delved into them at length. So I took the opportunity to listen through their previous 6 albums and try to get a handle on the story that Sammet is writing. That's a big reason why this review is as late as it is. In short, I wish I liked their discography a lot more than I do. Now, don't get me wrong, the group can put together some spectacular symphonic metal songs, but the albums themselves can feel pretty uneven, partially thanks to tracks not always doing enough to stand out from each other, with the exception of some god-awful synth choices, of course, partially because the writing can dip a little bit too often into metal cliche, and partially because the stories can get a little bit incomprehensible if you're trying to follow the plot and you don't have the lyric sheet in front of you. Now, this upcoming record is following along with the story of their 2013 album, The Mystery of Time, a record aiming for grander symphonic presence, which focuses on a character in Victorian England falling with what I basically describe as a steampunk machine cult. I definitely think it's a good, if hard to follow and frequently overwritten album, although I wouldn't say it always gives us their best individual songs, but apparently Ghostlights is going to be even bigger, even darker, even more grandiose. Was that really the case? Well, it certainly has a bigger, heavier feel to it, although if I was being honest, I have a hard time considering this all that dark by symphonic metal standards, which is a criticism that I make at pretty much all of Avantasia's material, but yeah, I definitely like this. I dug it. Probably even more when I was able to sit down and really decode the lyrics. And yet, on some level, it's probably going to fall into what I'd say about pretty much every Avantasia record. A fair few great songs, but as a whole, I keep wishing it had a bit more of a uniquely defining sound rather than the somewhat patchwork feel that it does have. That said, in terms of Avantasia records, this is definitely one of the better ones, the upper tier, a great slice of symphonic metal that hits more consistent high notes than I even expected. So let's start off with our vocalist, and with addition to the few returning singles from A Mystery of Time, with Ronnie Atkins and Michael Kiske doing a fair bit of heavy lifting, we also get our new cast of characters. The names that'll immediately jump off the page are Dee Snider, formerly of Twisted Sister, playing with his brand of broad theatricality on The Haunting, plus Jeff Tate of Queensryche stepping up for an imposing and methodical force of entropy. And I'd be remiss not to mention Within Temptation, Sharon Dan Adele return as the muse set to depart on Isle of Evermore, or how glad I was to hear Marco Hitalo just owning his cult mastermind role on Master of the Pendulum. The biggest surprise for me came with Robert Mason, formerly of Warrant, who has a clarity of tone in his voice that really stood out in a pretty overstuffed and bombastic mix. But my favorite was easily Jorn Lande, who brings a ton of texture, personality, and vocal range to his howls as the Lucifer figure of this record. A lot of emotional range too. If I were to find a criticism of the vocals anywhere, they might come with Tobias Sammet himself. Yes, he's improved by leaps and bounds since he started Avantasia, but partially by playing with a point of view character and partially because he's got such a huge murderer's row of talent behind him, he doesn't always stand out in the same way in these mixes. Granted, when you have so many power metal vocalists who have similar tenors, it can be tricky to tell them all apart regardless, but there are a few points where the vocal layering and production or arrangement could have emphasized the harmonies a little bit better. I definitely appreciated how they had Herbie Langens of Sinbreed singing his lower register on Draconian Love to add a little bit more of a gothic flavor to the song. Hell, it's something they could have done more across across this entire album, add a little bit more of that vocal arrangement diversity. Now this takes us to production and instrumentation, where yes, it's definitely true this album is heavy and dark by Avantasia standards, but let's be honest, in comparison with other symphonic metal bands, it's never quite as eerie or truly bleak as it could be. It's not Nightwish or Epica, for example. Part of this is in the composition, which is the mixed blessing when Avantasia can write such killer hooks, most of which are grounded in major chord progressions that don't always lend themselves to darker tones. But a larger issue comes in the production. While it's definitely clear the guitar work really is the star of the show here, with solos like on Babylon Vampires just being flat out insane and awesome, the actual guitar tones that carry more weight can be a little bit hit and miss for me. Sure, we do get some thunderous grooves and crunch like on Seduction of Decay with Jeff Tate, but I find myself often wishing we got a little bit more bass texture to really provide a good anchor point for these songs, a good foundation. But Seduction of Decay leads to another issue I've had with Avantasia in the past. The songs that sound like they could have been pulled straight from other metal albums from other metal bands. In that case, the horns accenting the groove like Sahara from Nightwish's Dark Passion Play from 2007. And that's not counting tracks that actually feature Nightwish and Within Temptation members that sound like cuts that could have been pulled from Imaginarium or The Silent Force respectively. Which isn't a full complaint, as I love both those albums, but it does mean that this album, Ghostlights, doesn't quite have as much unique instrumental identity as I was hoping for. And while the synths definitely take a more of a backseat than they have in the past, thank God, I can't say that I loved when they showed up both on Master of the Pendulum or Isle of Evermore respectively, or in the murkier feel of Draconian Love. It shows up more in the vocal layering and effects, but they can feel a little bit exasperating, especially as they don't really contribute to the dark feel of the songs. And then there's the lead-off track, Mystery of a Blood Red Rose, clearly included this album for the Eurovision entry for Germany, and from the female choral vocals to the slightly lighter riff, you can tell this was written for Meatloaf. It's just obvious. Only for Meatloaf to decline and for Salmon to record himself, and I have to be honest, it is kind of a lesser tier Meatloaf track if I'm being honest. And yet with all that, I can't deny how great some of these hooks and melodies are. There's not a bad instrumental on this album, and even the ones that are less distinctive on their own are still damn solid songs in their own right. But what I think draw this album together the most, more than I expected it would, are the lyrics and the themes. Now, full disclosure, for as much as The Mystery of Time does provide some additional connective tissue and a bit of additional context, you really don't need that album for this record to be understood. It does follow off of that record, with our lead character falling in with the machine cult and being driven on the path of relentless reason and logic, but the scene is set up very early on and it's well done, especially considering how our protagonist isn't quite sure hard reason is enough of an answer, especially in the face of death and decay and entropy, elements beyond his control, things that he can never understand. This is where the titular Ghostlights come into play, flickers that might seem supernatural and raise doubts that everything can be easily explained. And what I love here is the framing. You see that attractive power of reason, especially in the face of a guy that can seem capricious and uncaring, especially around Victorian England, but it also comes to see how quickly that machine logic burns out individuality and creativity out of a person. Like it or not, that humanity shines through and should be accepted. And when pursuing that wild human emotion all the way through, our protagonist encounters quite literally Lucifer, who tempts him towards throwing aside all reason in favor of wild passion. And yet, even he is framed more sympathetically than you would otherwise expect. It's clear the moral balance on this record is less good and evil than individualist versus authoritarian. And while it would be very easy for this record to take a hard stand in favor of one or the other, Avantasia doesn't really do that. Instead, it puts forward the knowledge that both options exist and have their merits and problems, and then consciously takes a step back, knowing that each side has its own purpose, just the choice is more important as it sets the example. Now, if I'm being honest, this dichotomy does feel a little bit shaky philosophically. Well, it's because the writing plays a little bit more towards dramatic abstraction. It doesn't quite have the proper parallel, but I will applaud the open answer and providing a fair amount of flexible framing on both sides. It does have a certain resonance there that I appreciate, and as such, I gotta be honest here, I really like this album. I'm not quite convinced that Avantasia has delivered their best release yet. I think that a slightly tighter writing and a greater sense of musical diversity and dynamics allowed soft within the song to really establish personality would make the supergroup stand out a hell of a lot more. But I also can't deny how much the hooks, the writing, and the vocal performances just really click for me. As such, yeah, for me it's a light 8 out of 10. Definitely a recommendation. It might be a late review, I can admit that, but I definitely think that Ghostlights by Avantasia was so worth it. So if you haven't had the chance yet to check this out, definitely do so. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I know this review is late, but as I said, a lot of albums in the discography I had to go through, and I have to say it, definitely worth it. But until then, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're talking to Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.